Hello, welcome to Collective Conscious, episode 5 out of Infinity. Today we are talking about what it means to be authentic. So we're just going to jump straight into it. So, Junwei, how about we start with an actual definition of what the authentic self is, what that means to you?
Yeah, sure. So I've been pondering on these thoughts for about a week now, and if I had to give a strict definition on what does it mean to be authentic, I think I just leave it as this, which is I'd say in living an authentic life is when your thoughts, words, and actions are all aligned, and if you're able to say exactly what you think with little to no filter, um, and if you have those three things of thoughts, words, and actions in almost complete alignment, um, I think you'll live pretty much an authentic life with very little regrets. If you're having to constantly censor what you're going to say because you're afraid of what people might think, I would say you're not living an authentic life. If you're shaping your behavior to match what is expected of you instead of going after what you really want, you're not living an authentic life. And sort of not as a kind of a half thought experiment, but if we had the power to read minds, I look into your deepest thoughts and I find things that will surprise me, because that's not who you say you are and that's not how you present yourself to the world with your actions and words, then you're not living an authentic life. Now, with all that, there's like a lot of caveats to what I said because there's a lot of you can poke a lot of holes in those definitions. But that's just a really broad definition I have. Um, and to give
Yeah,
more
that's go ahead.
just to give more context into like this idea of authenticity, I find that this I don't know if it's sensitive to time periods, but I have been noticing in the I guess 21st century with the advent of especially with the advent of social media that this idea of being real, like people don't like fake people. Like you always hear people saying like she's really fake, he's fake, like I don't like him. And I mean, you can tell when someone's being fake with like body language, how they speak, their tone of voice, mannerisms, etc. And funny enough, I'd imagine we sprinkle in some episode 2 of social norms in this episode because I feel like that would be pretty relevant for this topic. Um, but it seems like there's been like a kind of like a pandemic of like, uh, the idea of like people being fake and people just really don't like when people are fake. So those are my initial thoughts.
I think something that social media has enabled is it has made it a lot easier to be fake or to create a fake sort of persona to portray to the world because there's just a platform with which you can publicize it. I don't know if without social media existing, it would be so simple to create a persona that people may recognize more so than they recognize the person that they interact with in person. I think it's possible that for a lot of people, there's more exposure to their social media persona than there is to who they are in real life. You know what I mean?
Yeah, completely agreed. I mean, like social media, like you hear this all the time, but like the posts you see on Facebook or Instagram, it's like literally just like, it's a highlight of someone's life, and that's like such a small like pixel in their entire like picture that like it it, it can't be that real. I mean, I'd imagine some people are pretty real on social media, but I would say that's like the exception rather than the norm.
Yeah, I'm not sure if the purpose of social media even is really to be real. I mean, sometimes that might be true when maybe if an actual tragedy happens and you want people to know, maybe it's an effective way of communicating that without having to do it in person repetitively. Um, but I'm not sure that social media was really made for the mundane parts of life. I think that might defeat the purpose of social media itself. So, yeah, almost I would say by definition, the person you are on social media is not authentic or genuine because it leaves so much out. I want to go back to what you said in the very beginning though about the sort of definition of authenticity being an alignment between your correct me if I'm wrong, but you said thoughts, words, and actions, right?
Yeah.
So would you say that authenticity is basically like an internal consistency between those three things?
Yeah, I mean that's a good way to put it. It's and that's pretty much the same thing with what I said about if they're more or less aligned together.
Yeah, that makes sense. So thinking about that, I wonder, what do you think for most people, the biggest disconnect between any two of those things is? I'm guessing it's either between words and actions or thoughts and actions, I would say. What do you think?
Um, my gut instinct is probably between thoughts and actions, and I have this strong like opinion that like it's actually really hard to be authentic on a daily basis, even that like even with yourself actually, but rather at like in like work environments or school environments or even with like close friends, it's actually really hard to be authentic all the time. And I think there's like a host of reasons why people can't be authentic, and that can range from like social anxiety, imposter syndrome, um, you know, there's like peer pressure or like group things. Like, there's just so many like psychological, or like mental health things that like can prevent someone or hinder someone from being truly authentic. Um, and so to answer your question, I think the biggest hurdle is between your thoughts and your actions, because like so many times like you want to say what you want to say and it just doesn't come out because like maybe you're socially anxious, or you feel like that you don't fit in enough, or people will like criticize you. So I think the
Mm.
biggest disconnect is like thoughts and actions. Like you want to say what you say, and then when you actually want to say it, it doesn't the action can't follow.
Yeah, I think probably one significant cause of inauthenticity and the disconnect between thoughts and actions is, in some sense, fear of the truth, but more specifically, fear of how others will perceive the truth and fear of how others will perceive your true self in some sense. But I think at the same time, there's also, to varying degrees, utility in having slightly different personas for different situations, right? Like the person that you are at work, let's say your work persona, most likely and probably should be in some way different from your relationship persona. The way you talk or the things you do or are willing to do, they're going to be different. But I'm not sure if having different personas for different environments is the same thing as not being authentic. What do you think about that?
Can you repeat again? Like you're saying that your work persona should be is norm like generally speaking, your work persona is different than your like your relationship persona. Is that what you're saying?
I think for most people, yeah, that's probably true. Maybe that's not true for everyone. It was a bit of an assumption on my part, but
So,
at least for me, the way I act at work, the way I speak at work, it's different from the way I speak, with my friends or with my girlfriend or with my family. And the way I speak with my family is different from the way I speak with my friends. Like you do have, slightly different identities depending on the people that you're around, I would say. But at what point does that become inauthenticity? I don't know what the threshold would be really, because there's definitely usefulness to having those different personas.
so I think the question to tackle there is like, my question for you again is like I do agree people generally have like different personas from different environments they're in, but I think like that's just because of the environment they're in. Like, of course, you're gonna have like a different personality at work than in your relationship, because really, there's just some things you can't say at work because of it's generally regarded as being rude, and there's just some things you wouldn't say to your coworker that you would say to your girlfriend. Um, and yeah, no, that is a good question. Like, is that really being authentic if that's like if you're not saying what you really want to say? So I'll pass it back to you.
And I'm not 100% sure what my I would lean towards saying that in a technical sense and in maybe an overly technical sense, that yes, you are not being authentic if you have these different personas. But from the standpoint of usefulness, utility, I don't think authenticity is necessarily the most important thing. But then that leads into my next question, which would be, what is the value of authenticity and how can it help us So I'll start off with you again real quick. What do you think the value of authenticity is in someone's life? And beyond that, what do you think the value of knowing what your authentic self is, perhaps, and also actively trying to be your authentic self? I guess that's two separate questions, so you can choose which one to answer, maybe.
So yeah, I'll answer the first one. It's just what is the value of, of being authentic? And this goes back to my original thoughts on this topic, which is that like people don't like fake people, or sorry, yeah, people don't like people who are fake. And
Hmm.
um, I think it goes to show with like just even general experience or anecdotal experience that like being authentic is like somehow like a driver for like a closer social bond. Honestly, I would say in my experience, and I think there's like a good reason for that. And I think the main reason is like you're like being vulnerable, and again, like we're sprinkling in some thoughts on social norms from episode 2. But like if you're being vulnerable with someone, that kind of implies to the other person that like it conveys the notion that like you're able to be trusted because like you're kind of like exposing yourself, like not like physically but like with words or actions, like you're kind of like giving
Yeah,
yourself up.
absolutely.
And like and this kind of notion of being vulnerable to someone else is just like, oh wow, like he's like kind of like sacrificing his own like personal like ego for me, like that has to be like now I can probably trust him a little more. So I think that's a big factor into being authentic and why it's important.
That's a great point. I do agree that being authentic with someone probably enables a stronger relationship, or even if it's not necessarily a stronger relationship. So let's say you're not being authentic, right? But they actually believe that you are. So the effect on them is as if you were really being authentic. There's still a benefit to being actually authentic because the relationship will make more sense for you, like the person you are. It doesn't make sense to have a relationship with someone who thinks that you're someone else because it's not truly a relationship at that point. It's fabricated. It's
Right.
really non-existent.
And if I
So
could,
even if the person believes that you're being authentic, it's still a difference between being authentic and not.
yeah, following along that, like I think it's it's important to make the point, like how when you make friends with like when you try to make a new friend and sometimes you click with someone and sometimes you just don't click with someone. I think the don't click, there's like a lot of reasons why you wouldn't click with someone. So like that could be from like just your personality, your differing interest, or like compatibility in general. But I think one of the biggest reasons that like some people just click is like if two people are like genuinely being authentic with each other. And I think that's like one of the biggest reasons why some people might click with one another rather than people who don't. And I think it's like when two people are being real with each other, they have again this like social bond. Like I can't really even like describe how it looks like, but I think everyone understands the feeling of like like a friendship budding, and like that this person is like being authentic, and like it just you have this internal sensation that like you want to get closer to the person. And I think being authentic is like one of the main reasons why a friendship would form in the first place.
And I've definitely noticed in my own life with friendships that something that can really strengthen a friendship is an increase in the level of authenticity between the two people. So I'll give a quick example. I was friends with someone in college, and we were decent friends. I mean, we hung out. We probably hung out maybe about once a week, sometimes twice. So, we saw each other a decent amount, but it was mostly, I would say, surface level. Not to say that we didn't like each other because we did, but then about probably a year and a half or 2 years later, we just sat down and randomly it's kind of funny. We went out to bars the night before, and I got really sick in the morning. So it was like 5 a.m. and we were just hanging out in his living room talking because I was sick and he was awake because I don't even know why he was awake at 5 a.m. after going out. But either way, we had a really personal conversation, one like we've never had before. And ever since then, the friendship has been a lot stronger, I would say, than it was before that. So I think even if it happens over time and not necessarily instantly, the value of authenticity remains.
Yeah, that's a good example to bring up, and it's actually funny that you brought up going in the bars because like I just thought of this, but like I wanted to ask you your thoughts on like alcohol as like a it's a silly question honestly, but like alcohol as a cause of authenticity because like people have this you always hear this stereotype, right? I'm just making general statements, but I do hear this a lot, which is like I'm more real when I'm drunk, or I'm more real when I'm like intoxicated. Like, and there's like a good reason why a lot of people say that. And I'm still debating with myself with whether that like that's correct or not. I mean, like it is like a substance, so like it does inhibit the mind in various chemical processes. But it is interesting to like to hear that like when people use these substances, like they gain more authenticity apparently.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. All right, so let's bring it back to how you originally defined authenticity, right? Thoughts, words, and actions.
Yep.
Something that I would say alcohol does potentially, let's say for some people, is that it can decrease the disconnect between thoughts and actions because it decreases your inhibition, right? But the thoughts, yeah, I would have to ask an actual scientist about this, but I don't know if it changes your underlying thoughts or motivations as much as it changes your willingness to act on those. So if someone wanted to say that alcohol made them a more authentic version of themselves, I could probably see that being true, but I don't know if I would say that's true for me necessarily. I think it might be on a individual basis.
Yeah, that's I can see that. And like there I feel like there's also the opposite way too. Like when people get intoxicated and they wake up the next morning and they also have like a lot of regrets, not because necessarily they're drinking too much, but like they did things or they said things that they shouldn't have. So I feel like it actually might go both ways. Like you can be like probably over authentic. I don't know if that's really a thing, but like you can do
I don't
things
know if you
that
can
you
be.
regret.
I, I don't know if over authenticity, I think that's kind of an oxymoron, right? Because authentic is sort of an absolute
Right, right.
statement or state of being. I'd have to think about that a little more. But then it raises the question, like, and I sort of proposed one answer to this, but if alcohol could make you more authentic, then why that drug specifically? And if it's not that drug specifically, maybe what other drugs could have the same effect? Because, all right, so like, let's say you do something like PCP, right, which is a pretty strong dissociative and hallucinogen, and you go out and like do some crazy shit, running around naked in the streets or something, right? I think it's pretty safe to say that that's not making you a more authentic version of yourself, probably because it's creating thoughts that wouldn't have otherwise occurred. So I think the question for alcohol comes down to, is it creating thoughts that wouldn't have otherwise occurred? Or is it just creating actions that wouldn't have otherwise occurred based off thoughts that you would have had regardless? And I think for myself, actually, I'm not sure. I'm not sure about myself. What about you? Do you have an idea of how you'd feel about that?
Yeah, I think whether alcohol causes your thoughts to be inhibited or actions being inhibited, like it's kind of like a chicken and egg kind of thing. And I also don't uh, really have a good answer. I think I would want to explore like kind of like a threshold level of alcohol in terms of like maybe like there's this threshold. I mean, depends on every person's tolerance to alcohol, but like I feel like there might be like this threshold where like if you this is under the assumption like if you drink alcohol you become more authentic, but like there might be like a threshold level for each person where like you drink this much alcohol and like that's your like 100% truly authentic self with your thoughts, words, and actions are all aligned. And then when you go past that threshold you actually like that percentage actually like goes down because like you do things that like you wouldn't actually do when you're sober.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Maybe it's like finding an optimal point on a curve. So moving beyond that quickly though, one thing that I wanted to bring up was how I envisioned my idea of authenticity. And I think the biggest component of that for me is the incorporation of the things we don't like about ourselves into ourself. And so what I mean by that is essentially not repressing the aspects of our self, our sense of self that we don't like, not ignoring them really. Um, and that's not to say like that we have to act on them necessarily, but to at the very least be aware of them and develop them in a healthy way. So, one example would be, I would say every human is born with the ability to do great violence under the right circumstances, even after being socialized. I mean, one example would be the existence of a society like Nazi Germany, right? I think we've talked about this on one of the episodes, but you would say that before Hitler took power, it was a society that was in great turmoil, but at the same time, it was still arguably a pretty modern society, and the people inside that society were arguably pretty similar to the people inside our current society for the most part. And so the idea that they could all get to this state of being willing to commit great acts of violence, to me, shows that that exists within every person, right? And so I think something that is deeply correlated with our authentic self is recognizing those parts of ourself and incorporating them into our own personality, even if it's difficult to do so, and even if we don't want to acknowledge them.
So how do we do that on a like practical level? So like what I'm hearing from you is like, humans experience natural emotions, and you're saying that like it's probably best not to suppress them, but rather than like if you feel emotion, like let yourself feel it, like let yourself cry, let yourself be angry, let yourself feel shame, whatever the emotion is, and then like I guess like is that is letting the emotions come to you rather than suppressing, is that supposed to give you like more insight to your life, and like that might change your thought processes on things?
Yeah, I think a pretty big piece of that, and possibly the most important piece of that, is allowing ourselves to experience our natural reactions to things, specifically our emotions. I don't think repressing our emotions in the long term is ever a good idea. So yeah, that's definitely a big piece of it, I would say. And of course, it's not an easy thing to do. I mean, everybody has things about themselves that they at some level of consciousness are aware of and don't like about themselves, right? Like, I'm not going to get too personal with it, but there are things about myself that I'm aware of and I don't like, but it's not helpful to ignore those or pretend they don't exist or pretend that they don't affect me in some way. I think what's probably more useful is acknowledging them, trying to understand them, even if that doesn't end up working, and incorporating them in a healthy way into our or my personality. Um, but I think the idea of ignoring the things that we don't like about ourselves and trying to get rid of them is probably more harmful than it is helpful.
I absolutely agree with your line of thought there. And I think this like kind of goes more deeper into like psychotherapy and like CBT, but like there's like a really good amount of research, like not even research, just like scientific evidence saying that like when you feel emotion, like you have like you feel things, you feel like literally like physical sensations in your body, whether that be like your chest tightening or like a lump in your throat, or you have these physical sensations, and it's like, and those are like evolutionary, right? Like you don't just feel those, like those aren't random just because you felt those emotions. Like it's obviously not a coincidence that like when you feel anxious, like your chest becomes tighter, like there's a reason for that. And I think one of the most important things, just as a final note for this subtopic, is that like, yeah, let your emotions come to you, and like let your like feel what your body is saying, because like I think like your body, um from what at least my experience, like is trying to tell you something when you're sad or when you're angry, like, and if you really feel what your body is feeling, like that can give you like more insight into like trying to process the emotion, and that's like step one of like a really like large really like I guess for most people like a long healing phase.
Yeah, that reminds me. I'm trying to remember the name of this, but it's the idea of like, I think it was Plato, like Plato's cave, the idea that humans are inside this cave, right? And we can only see the reflections of the fire or something. We can only see a certain perception of the outside world. We can't step outside the cave. And that's what limits our observational abilities. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I think it's referred to the allegory of the cave.
Yeah. So I think that's true of observing the outside world, but I think it's equally true of observing what/who we are, like the entirety of our consciousness, incorporating all levels of consciousness, like the conscious, the subconscious, the unconscious, depending on what psychoanalytic theory you subscribe to, the non-conscious. Regardless, all levels of consciousness, I think we have access to a very limited subset of all those levels of computation, maybe you could say. And that's part of the reason I think we should listen to those feelings that we get, that we don't fully understand, but there are millions, possibly billions of years of evolutionary wiring that have gone into producing those things. And I think it's foolish to ignore them. Because in reality, we think of ourselves as 20 years old, 30 years old, but we're really millions and potentially billions of years old, because we really are the aggregation of everything that's come before us. We're not independent life forms. I mean, we think of ourselves as independent life forms and organisms, but we're really not, because everything that has come before us is a part of us. And so it doesn't make any sense to ignore that.
Yep, completely agreed. And I guess just one final note is that like, yes, like we're part of like a lineage of like billions of, I mean evolution, like evolutionary wise, like humans have existed for a pretty long time now. But like in addition to like those thoughts, I think like also listening to like you're also part of like your own like child. So like even if you're like fully grown adult now, whether it be like you're 20 or you're like 70, doesn't matter the age. Like there's also like a lot of unprocessed emotion from like childhood. I would say like just I think everyone has just like no matter how severe it is, like everyone has like some trauma to process from their childhood. So you also have those wounds to look at too. I want to dive into this other topic that relates to authenticity, which is like lying. And I think that's a really really like relevant topic to this and like I want to get your thoughts on like when is it like justified to lie. Yeah, that's the question.
It's funny you mentioned that, because I've actually been thinking about that quite a bit recently. Specifically the question that you just asked, when is it actually okay to lie? Like, are white lies okay, or are they not? And functionally, I think our natural reaction to that question would be to say, yeah, white lies are okay, but you shouldn't lie about big things. I think that's probably another case of people's words not matching their actions, though. But the more I think about it, the less I think even the small lies are okay. Even something like, telling someone that their cookies are good when they're shitty, it's the classic example, right? Someone brings you really bad cookies, they worked hard on them. You're not supposed to tell them that they suck. And you don't have to say they suck. But to me, it still makes more sense to tell the truth, even if you're doing it in a, not harsh way, because this is really the way I think about it, right? The universe and society are some sort of like fabric, right? And let's say it's made out of, this is the way I'm visualizing it in my head. Universe and society are made out of some sort of like rubbery plain fabric sort of thing. So it's sort of like how they envision when they visualize gravity in those animations where it's like a grid with the warping in it. You know what I'm talking about?
Yep.
So imagine society as a completely flat version of that for a second with the same physical properties. The way I think about lying is that every single dishonesty that's introduced into the system is a warping of the system in some way. But as a whole, the system must remain in a sort of equilibrium. And so every lie that you tell has some sort of snapback, even if you can't perceive it, and even if it's not you that it affects. The universe always, and society, they always remain in a sense of equilibrium. And I think dishonesty is something that is sort of like I think it's the third law of motion. Every reaction has an equal and opposite reaction. So I would say, in conclusion to that, even small lies should be avoided. What about you?
That's a interesting way to picture it. So like back to your cookie example, or those like classic like white lies. I think like I agree with you. Like just because I mean, you don't have to be. You can be authentic without being an asshole, right? So like, you don't have to like tell. Like, there's a very like stark difference between like saying like your cookies suck ass to like, I think I know this recipe that like might be better suited for this. Like there's like a lot of like polite and like good human things, good human ways to go about telling the truth. And I think lying in general, if you really think about it, it's like lying is just your attempt to control another human being, nothing more and nothing less. And I found that with like
Great way of putting it.
Yeah, like personal experience to say that like it's actually like kind of like it's kind of a paradox, because like when you surrender trying to control another human being, that's when you actually gain freedom. It's not when you're lying to someone. Like that actually like restricts you from like, it makes you feel trapped. Like if you want to transform your life, you want to speak truthfulness, and like if you commit to being true, like your actions must change. And I think like lying is like, it makes you feel like cornered, right? Like it's just like this like kind of feeling in your gut, which is like it feels wrong, but like you're still doing it, and like it's just controlling another person, which that can't be right.
Yeah, I heard something once, and you'll recognize this, that stuck with me very deeply, because as soon as I heard it, I thought to myself, oh, that is definitely true. Wow. And it was that one of the biggest arrogances in humans is the idea that we can control other humans in some way or any way, because we can't. We just can't. Like, it doesn't work that way. There are a lot of people out there who are just trying to get around by manipulating. And to combine what you just said with what I said before that, it's always going to come back to them, always, in one way or another. And it doesn't matter if they understand how it's coming back to them or the reason that things are happening to them. You know, I think something that happens oftentimes is that someone will tell some sort of small lie, right? Or it doesn't even have to be a small lie, but just a lie that they think they got away with. And it can take, 5 or 6 sort of transitions down some sort of causal link before it gets back to them, but it will always get back to them. And then they'll ask themselves at that point, like, why is this happening to me? Why do I deserve this? But if you actually look back at why certain things are happening, I bet a lot of it is due to things that they did, and specifically lies that they told. And that's not to say that there's no such thing as people being unlucky. Of course, people can be unlucky, but I think for the most part, you can always overcome something like that, so long as you behave in a way consistent with equilibrium. I'll put it that way.
Well, first, I love the Dr. K shout out. He's one of my favorite streamers right now. And I was gonna ask, doesn't Jordan Peterson have like in his 7 Rules of Life like one of those chapters, like it's like online?
I'm not sure off the top of my head. As
Okay.
you know, I'm a big Jordan Peterson fan, but I haven't read the book 12 Rules for Life, and I don't know
Gotcha.
all the rules off the top of my head. I'm pretty sure that you're right, though. I'm pretty sure one of them is about not lying. I don't know what the extent of. I don't know what his argument is beyond that, though.
So I
So,
guess
what we
go ahead.
go ahead.
You got it.
Okay, I'll go. I was gonna say, how about we wrap up what we what we have been trying to talk about into something usable for anybody listening.
Yeah, sure. So, I guess I would my initial thoughts on that is like if you want to kind of transform your life from like an inauthentic to an authentic one, I think one of the first steps is I think this is like my answer to like this is the first steps to almost anything, but like awareness. And uh, I think being aware of like when you're trying to be authentic and when you're not being authentic is like a really good place to start. And once you figure out like, okay, this is like a situation where like I know I'm being authentic, and I think if you just go on like your personal experience, like I think the more experience you have with that and just like um introspecting after like after interaction and seeing like, oh, this time I was authentic and it felt better, or this time I was inauthentic and it felt worse. And there's a lot of correlation there. And I think like the next step is like acknowledging that like lying is probably not the best course of action in almost every case. And doesn't mean that like you have to be an asshole or like you have to like I mean, in a way you kind of have to beat around the bush in that case. But there's like ways to go about it where you don't have to lie to like get your point across or to be authentic. um and then from there is just like and this is like the age old saying, but like, yeah, I mean, just be yourself. And I went back and forth with like that advice with like just be yourself, and it's a very broad like general statement, which I actually not a super huge fan of, but I do like that advice because like that's like the only in its purest sense like the only true way to be authentic. So those are my closing thoughts.
I think one way you can make the statement "just be yourself" a little better, actually a lot better, is to modify it slightly by saying just be the best version of yourself. It's still yourself, but you can easily let yourself become something horrible. And on the flip side, you can help yourself become something great without sacrificing your own identity, your own authenticity. So what I would say is the takeaway from this whole thing is twofold. First of all, understand the negative parts of yourself and the things that you don't like, and don't ignore them. Incorporate them into your personality in as healthy a way as possible. And the second part is, like you said, tell the truth as much as possible, or always, ideally, tell the truth. And going back to the cookie example real quick before we end this episode, there's a way to tell the truth without hurting the person's feelings that badly. All you have to say is, I appreciate the gesture very, very much, and it made me happy that you made these cookies. That's not a lie. And then you could still say like, hey, I have this really great recipe, or I think this had too much like sugar or something, whatever about the cookies themselves. But whether or not the cookies are good isn't actually the point of the gesture they're making in the first place. The point is that they're trying to do something nice. And so that's all you really need to acknowledge in that situation. And I think that sort of logic can be applied to a lot of situations where people feel it's okay to lie. So that's how I'll wrap it up. To all the listeners out there, thank you for tuning in. This has been Junwei and Tyler with Collective Conscious, episode 5 out of Infinity. Take care.